to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Steve has some pamphlets he'd like to pass around about McCary's legacy.
Yeah.
And if you want one, take one. You're welcome to take one. He also has some programs for the rest of the year here. Okay, Steve's going to give a program on, the title of it is Something's Up on Downer Street, and I'm going to let him explain what the whole thing's going to be all about.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So, the first thing I'm going to do is pass out the most recent newsletter from McCary's Legacy. So there are two separate historical organizations in the community. One is McCary's Legacy, which is really dedicated to preserving history, historical artifacts, and operates the Shacksboro Museum. Beauchamp Historical Club is really a group that gets together and talks about topics of historical interest. And so I'm here serving two masters tonight because I'm a member of both, and I think the town's probably would benefit from everybody being part of all of it. So I'm just going to pass these out, and then I'll pass out the programs for the Beauchamp Club. I'm going to start with you. So in the newsletter, you can kind of see what McCary's Legacy does, how it's different from Beauchamp. We're also selling bricks. I'm going to shill shamelessly for a second here. One of our primary fundraisers right now is we have a brick pathway out in front of the museum. And so we're engraving people's names in there for donations. So if you're so inclined, you can honor someone or something in a brick, and we'll install it in front of the museum. This is the first of 4 presentations I'm going to do. The others are in January, March, and May. I don't like to hear myself talk, but nature abhors a vacuum. So when nobody else volunteered, you were there, right? Back me up on this.
We were happy you volunteered.
So if you don't like my presentation, you can have it next. You can do it next time. How about that? So I'm going to pass out the, if you don't have them already, I know Mary was passing these out at the door. So if you get super, super bored during the presentation, you've got 2 things to read to keep yourself interested. Now we got to get this back up on the screen. So I'm having a little bit of technical problems, but hopefully that won't get in our way. That's it for housekeeping. The only thing else I guess I would say is that this is going to be a very long, dry presentation unless and until people raise their hands, ask questions, contribute things. I don't pretend to know everything about Baldwinsville history. There are at least 6 people in the room that know infinitely more than I do. And there are some people who've forgotten more than I'll ever know, so please join in. I chose these 2 pictures because we're named after a guy named William Beauchamp. He was kind of a Renaissance man for his time. I put these pictures up there because, number one, on the right, he was incredibly learned. He wrote, help me out, Bonnie, easily over 100 books on Central New York. Right. Primarily about Native American history, culture, the Haudenosaunee, basically any early works about that tribe, that nation. He actually wrote the first books. On the left, anybody who can pedal around Baldwinsville with a boater on, I think is my hero. So I hope to do that someday when I'm 95. Just wanted to take a minute in addition to him because he wrote so much and studied so much about the history of our community. There's some other people that came along that did as well. Leslie Voorhees, Pearl Palmer, and Tony Christopher all contributed a lot. If you're just getting into history or want to know more, there's some books like Tony Christopher's. He put together a lot of columns that he wrote in the 60s and 70s that appeared in the Messenger. They're phenomenal in terms of their topical interest. Pearl Palmer took a bunch of columns that she wrote in the 40s. She wrote basically weekly for almost a decade, and those are all here to enjoy. Bonnie's going to jump up and say every time, and these are available at the local library, and they are. Leslie Voorhees, I don't know how she did it. This was in the age long before computers, but she went around, not only took a lot of the cemetery inscriptions from the 12 cemeteries in the area. I don't know how many there are. A lot. and then interviewed people about their individual genealogies. In addition to this book, there are probably a dozen like it in Syracuse about family genealogies, so if that's of interest to you. And then, who did I miss up there? I haven't missed anybody. But then we're going to move on to a couple of others that I think are equally important, and that's when I first started this crazy hobby, you know, I like to say some men gamble, some men fish, some men hunt, some men, I don't know what. I research and write about local history, so I'm a little strange. But the first people I sought out were Bonnie and Sue McMahon, and they've done so much to contribute to Baldwinsville history. So Sue couldn't make it tonight, but Bonnie, I'd like everybody to give her a round of applause for what she's contributed. And Sue's not here, so I took the opportunity to plagiarize shamelessly from her book, Greater Baldwinsville. So don't tell her I did that. So the first slide I put up here, the topic of this whole presentation is Something's Up on Downer Street. And I bumped into a story that I thought was pretty interesting. I kind of look for not the obvious, because they've all been written about, but the stories that are kind of obscure and unusual, maybe a little eccentric, about people and events from our past that a lot of folks maybe haven't heard about. So this one concerns spiritualism in Baldwinsville, and the first thing that popped in my mind was the Ouija board. So raise your hand if you've ever used a Ouija board in your life. Okay, you're an occultist. No, you're... that was really an offshoot of spirituality. I remember, you know, as a kid at my grandparents' farm in the 60s, I'd be there for the weekend, and it wouldn't be unusual to sit around with my grandparents and do the Ouija board, and then go to church at the Congregational Church on Sunday morning, and it was like, no big deal. So it was really entertainment, but I'll read from the screen. I know you're not supposed to do that, but it came right out of American 19th century obsession with spiritualism, the belief that the dead are able to communicate with the living. It worked for Americans. It was compatible with Christian dogma. Spiritualists actually most are Christians, most are mainline Christians, mostly Protestants, but they could hold a seance on Saturday night and have no qualms about going to church the next day. That was my grandparents. No drinking, no smoking, no dancing, but break out the Ouija board. So it was an acceptable, wholesome activity to contact spirits at seances, and there were other activities that you could pursue. Here's an original Ouija board from 1890. 1967, this blew me away. There were 2 million Ouija boards sold in 67, more than the game of Monopoly in the United States. So, kind of crazy. Everybody's worried about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I say we should have been worried about the Ouija boards. But, and then it even, you know, Norman Rockwell, it doesn't get any more Americana, motherhood and apple pie than that, but he graced one cover of the Saturday Evening Post with 2 people using a Ouija board. And interestingly enough, I read the background on this. He was vacationing in Potsdam, New York in the 20s, teens and 20s, and went to a dance hall, and everybody else was watching the girls dance, and he was fascinated by this couple in the corner that were using a Ouija board. So it really was part of a popular culture and kind of an offshoot of what we're here to talk about today. This is called Look What I Found on eBay. I have a lot of sources for information and artifacts about local history. eBay's a great place to go. You don't have to buy, but you can find out a lot of things. I lost out on this paper. As you can see, I was too cheap to fork over 10 bucks and let it go. But the paper looked interesting, and when I printed out the description, I actually wasn't looking for it, but I was researching another story back in 2010, and it said, in this issue is an interesting article on a seance held by trance medium Carrie Downer of Baldwinsville, in which she channeled the spirit of Edgar Allan Poe. I was like, wow, I got to look into that. Of course, I lost the auction. Then I had to go do some work to find out what really happened. It says when she's under a trance, the paper states, she could deliver poems and could lecture on the most advanced of scientific principles. At this seance, she delivered a lecture on evolution, which was relatively new at the time, tracing life from infinitesimal atoms to the highest forms of human existence. Miss Downer then passed under the influence of Edgar Allan Poe and delivered 2 poems, which were identical with Poe's style, but were of entirely new composition and considerable length. She claims she knows nothing of what she says. That's pretty much what I say too. Either before or after the trance, and she also speaks very rapidly. So whether you believe in this stuff, don't believe in it, open mind, whatever, you know, it is what it is, and that's what happened. So that's kind of what got me interested in the story, and the more I looked into it, the more interested I got. So 3 questions for me came to mind, and I'll try to get this done in 45 minutes. It's, what can we learn about her early life 150 years ago? I think it's just interesting to go back and think about, I've got some friends in here, and we camp and visit places, and sometimes we say, gee, I wonder what this place looked like 150 years ago, right? Before all the technology, the traffic, the roads, whatever. What did this place really look like? What was life like back then? The second is, what can we learn about spiritualism in Baldwinsville? Because there was a controversy, right? And then what can we learn about her as a spiritualist? Those were the central 3 questions that I was investigating. First thing, I'll get into a little genealogy. I won't bore you with too much details, but the guy on the left is her father, Willard Hosmer Downer. He married Jane Eliza Smith. He was from Connecticut. He came here. He opened a store in Warner's circa 1840, somewhere in there, and then moved to Betts Corners. Who knows where Betts Corners is? Bonnie, you cannot answer this question. Come on, somebody's got to know where Betts Corners is. No? Fred? Huh? Lysander Hamlet was Betts Corners. Before that was Vickery's Settlement. So he went out there, and believe it or not, at the time there were enough people living in the area where he had a pretty healthy general store out there with a guy named Norton. And then, not the guy from the Honeymooners. And then he moved back into Baldwinsville and started another store, had 4 kids, and the last was Carrie Eliza Downer. She was born in April of 1853, so we're talking, what is that now, almost 175 years ago, basically. So I try to think about what events could have happened in her life that led her to pursue what she pursued, because there's precious little about her early life. Right? She was a woman in the mid-1800s. Let's face it, they were second-class citizens, unfortunately. There wasn't a lot written about them. They didn't have a lot of power. And so I tried to find out things that could have influenced her. Tragically, Willard, less than a week before he was supposed to be married, his wife just went and bought a new bonnet for the wedding, and on the way home, she was thrown by the horse and was killed, tragically. So little things like that contribute. And then a couple of years later, when they were living on Downer Street, the house almost burned down with Carrie in it. And then according to one source, she became a spiritualist or trance speaker while recovering from severe illness, and that we understand against her own wishes and that of her parents. I'm sure that's true. The influence coming upon her unsought. So she claimed that this just happened to her, and who knows kind of what tragedy in her past or her family's past led her to do this. She grew up in a house on Downer Street. That's where it got its name. They were the first house on the corner, so that's what the name became. This is from the one on the left is from a house tour back in '75. It's allegedly a perfect example of a Greek revival style house. And the one on the right I just took recently. It's a beautiful house, lots of rooms, very interesting history, very interesting architecture like so many in our village. It sat on the southwest corner of Downer and Syracuse. I get to use this, is great. I love these things. So right there, today there's 2 more houses there between the corner and Syracuse, but at the time the Downers owned all of that land, and the house was really the first on the corner. The other things that I think are interesting to look at here, number one is that you see a school right here, right? So anybody know what school that was? Bonnie, I know you're just chomping at the Mary? There was the white school, right. So there was a very, very early school. You've heard about the Southside Academy, which was on the grounds where Shacksboro is today. That big park was a giant, basically elementary through intermediate school that was enormous, 3-story brick building. But this preceded it. What else is on there of interest?
It's still there.
It's still there, you're right. And you can see where the Catholic Church is today. St. Mary's was a property of E.E. Wells. He was a big business person too, because at this time the Catholic Church was in its infancy in Baldwinsville. Anybody know where the Catholic Church was? On Tappan Street. So if you see that apartment building on the corner of, is it McCary or Seneca? McCary and Tappan was an old folks home, and before that was actually the Catholic Church before they built the church on Syracuse Street. Here's the old white school. You see it on the left and right. We don't have any old photos that I know of this building, but it actually was built in 1846 and is still standing. That's a little hard to believe. The white building on the corner, when I was a kid growing up over in the Ford tract, was known as Totten's Grocery. But the one next to it was the white school, and it operated from 46 to 85 until the Southside Academy was built. So why am I showing you all these things? Well, you know, that was her house. This is where she went to school. We're talking about going back 150 years ago. Yeah.
The white school wasn't a public school, was it?
That I don't know. I assumed it was, but
I thought it was like a private academy. Maybe.
it could have been at first. Later on, it was part of the public school program because it was replaced by the Southside Academy, which was a public school. It may have started as a private one, and that was pretty common in those
You
days
really
too.
have to look at it from the back now to see
Is that
that
the
it's
same
older.
building?
It's on the left over there. This is from the left. You're looking at it from the right over there. It's the one on the left. She worshipped at the Mescable Episcopal Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, in 2 different locations. Back in 1846, there was a small ME church built on the west side of Oswego Street. Help me out here. It's across from where the Presbyterian Church is now, which was Andrew's Furniture. I don't know what's there now. Help me out. Who knows? Whatever. And then it moved in 1870 down to Charlotte Street in Genesee. So this is where she would have gone to church and kind of become a Protestant practitioner. As she left the South Side on her way to go to church or to see her dad's store or whatever else, she would have seen these things. These are all from Sue McManus's Greater Baldwinsville book. This is Syracuse Street looking north in around 1880. Up here you see the Presbyterian Church in a place called Herrick's Hall, which was the old Presbyterian Church, which was a meeting place. Up here you see the Amos Mill, which was the dominant mill on the river at the time. And next to it, anybody know what that is? Well, it's on here. Grace Episcopal Church, the original one before it burned and was moved. So kind of an interesting shot. This is Hax's Bakery, Blanchard Monuments, right, Bruce? So that was around a long time. And as you can see from here, there's no canal to cross. This is just the Seneca River at the time. The canal was the Baldwin Canal, which is right there, looking north. There was no barge canal. So you had a lot of healthy businesses on Water Street. As she turned left at the Four Corners to head to the later church, that's where we are right now. That's the old village hall. So this building eventually replaced that one. The reason the chimney, or it's not really a chimney, it wasn't a fireplace, does anybody know why that giant stack's on the top?
Dry the hoses.
This is great, you know. All right, yeah, to dry the fire hoses, because it also doubled as a fire department at the time. And this is a millinery shop. Somebody had to tell me 2 weeks ago what a milliner did. No clue. Anybody know what a milliner did? Okay, they make hats, right? Ladies' hats, not just men's hats, ladies' hats. So I'm not really in the market for ladies' hats, therefore I didn't know.
Wait a minute, that house, when the village hall burned down, they had to have more land to put up the new one. And that house was moved, if you go to Tessone's, the second house up beyond Tessone's is that house.
Interesting. So they repurposed it. Cool.
You mentioned the Methodist Episcopal and then the Grace Episcopal.
Mm-hmm.
Grace Episcopal is down near the river, the canal, Baldwin. That's the one that got the first electric lights in the country?
Yeah, the one on Elizabeth Street, when it was here, was the first electrified church in the United States. And then it burned. I wonder why. You know, electricity was in its infancy, and then it got moved to its current location.
100 years, and it burned because of arson.
Oh, it did? I assumed it was electricity. Okay, another story to look into. I didn't do it. The Four Corners looked very different. I can't even tell you what's on the Four Corners today. They change pretty rapidly, but on the northeast corner, so if you're coming up Oswego, Syracuse, heading due north on Oswego to go up the hill, on your right-hand side, which is where I think Farrell, the law office, is now. This was the American Hotel, the first hotel in Baldwinsville, 1831 to 1889. Hotels were really important back then because a lot of people traveled for business, especially to Baldwinsville, because there was so much industrial activity and so much milling going on. You had big companies like Morris Machine Works or its predecessor, and they had to come visit, and they needed places to stay. When the barge canal was put through in the early teens, hotels were really a necessity because you brought in all these workers from other places to construct them. On the southeast corner of the Four Corners, which was where the old Masonic Temple was and is now a tattoo parlor and any other number of establishments, was the Upson block. Upson was a prominent Baldwinsvillian. He was the kind of tobacco baron of Baldwinsville. He had tobacco warehouses all over the village and had contracts with a lot of local farmers to grow tobacco. And at that time, it wasn't cigarette tobacco, it was cigar tobacco, because it was of a different quality, and it all got shipped down to New York City, basically. The other corners, on the northwest corner where, what is now? The Bride Shop, thank you, was the first of 3 Seneca hotels. You got to give it to the proprietors of the Seneca hotels. You know, this one was built 1832, it burned in 83, they built another one, it burned I think in 89, they built another one. So there were a lot of Seneca hotels. They finally gave up the ghost, I think, around the turn of the century. The other corner, which is where the Purple Painted Lady is now, and a number of businesses in that block, including one that my grandfather and father had, was W.H. Downer and Son. You can see it's a huge store. It goes from there actually even further west. That's about 1880. He started that business in 1870. He actually had a previous business back where Water Street is before the barge canal came in, and it was displaced by that. But he did it all. They had a little bit of everything, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. He's in one of those doorways. Eliza, can you point out which one he is? Probably not, no. Okay, I couldn't either. Just know he's there. So his first store was on the south side of the Seneca River in the Dunbar block on Water Street, which is right where the canal is now. So it was one of the blocks that was displaced when the canal was built. It's kind of interesting reading these old ads. I got a kick out of this. And these are from the 1850s, so this is going way back. Let's see. I'm trying to see what he said that I thought was quite interesting. Oh, the subscriber, him, takes this, perhaps somewhat unusual method, to notify his friends and customers that he's greatly in want of cash to pay certain bills too numerous to mention. They're due and maturing against him, and for which it is absolutely necessary to provide the means of payment. The undersigned would also respectively suggest that as settlement usually and naturally precedes payment, it is desirable to have the preliminaries arranged as soon as possible, and therefore solicits all having unsettled accounts with him to call and settle the same without delay, and further, to those who design to give him a good note to be paid after harvest, that they would confer a favor by first shelling out what cash they can spare on their accounts, as the subscriber is at present more pressed by liabilities now due and maturing than he may be after. Basically what he's saying is, I need money or I'm going to go out of business, pay up, which is what I would have said. In the middle, he talks about $20,000 worth of inventory. This is just within months of what he wrote here, so clearly he got his hands on some cash, and he's advertising all the stuff he brought in, ready-made clothing, crockery, hardware, and now terms cash, but interesting, barter economy, butter, cheese, eggs, and most kinds of farmers' produce taken in exchange for goods. So the barter economy was alive and well, and perhaps it should come back. And then I felt kind of bad for him. He had this big ad about his old brick store. He's received a fresh assortment of dry goods, but it's not new goods, it's new goose at the top. So I don't think I would have paid for that ad. They kind of have a gross misspelling. So then when he relocated to the new block and the new store, you know, now he's starting to get aggressive, right? And as a former advertiser and marketer, I really had to admire his gumption at some of this stuff. You know, the inducements are 3. 1, large and perfect assortment of each. 2nd, goods first class in every respect. 3rd, prices below all competition. nothing's really changed in 150 years, right? You know, your mailbox is full of stuff like this now.
Why is there a blank after W?
Oh, this was just my search term, and so it highlights it when it comes up. That was my doing. I was searching for his name. He gets interesting, though, I think, for the times. Over here, every letter in Downer was made by the letter. So this D is made by little d's, the O is made by little O's, the W is made by little W's. He got kind of clever and creative, so I thought that was kind of remarkable. But then he gets a little hard sell, right? It's ladies' hoods, ladies' nubias, which I don't know what that is. Ladies' felt skirts, on and on and on. And then the final one on the right, I read over and over again, and I can't quite, for the life of me, figure out what it is he's trying to sell. Can anyone?
Pajamas?
Oh, flannels, right. Yeah, he mentions it, what, 12 times. Flannels, 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 flannels. So the hard sell and in-your-face advertising did not start in our lifetimes. It was alive and well a long time ago. Going back to where they lived, circa 1880, you got this bird's eye map. The Downers lived right here in this house. They owned all the land at the corner. And across the corner was a very prominent Baldwinsville man named D.C. Greenfield, to whom I'm distantly related by marriage. He was a lawyer and a banker, pretty well off. I don't know if the Kinslows could make it tonight, but that's the Kinslow home now, if you've seen it there on the northwest corner of Downer and Syracuse. You can see it up there on the top. What's interestingly, his wife was a foster. My mother was a foster. And she was a florist and had a greenhouse in town. She was one of the very, very, very few women who was a proprietor that actually had her own going concern in business. Have no idea whether it's profitable, but she was highly respected as a florist and operator of a greenhouse. This is kind of, this is called a word cloud. So what I did in my spare time is I went to the 1875 Baldwinsville directory and I counted up all the occupations and the number of people in each occupation, and I compared the men and the women. And this is kind of getting at where Carrie Downer might have been coming from, coming of age about this time as a 21-year-old woman with very limited education and power, in that there were 76 different occupations listed in the Baldwinsville directory that year. 230 men operated in those businesses, okay? So some of them had multiple operators. There were only 9 occupations that women participated in, and only 24 of them. And you can see what were big on the radar screen. So it was great for guys to be blacksmiths, carpenters, physicians, masons, grocers, lawyers, saloon keepers, very important. But you know, for the women, it was dressmaker, shirt maker, milliner, we now know what that is, boarding house, nurse, carpet weaver. So, you know, women were really relegated, if they were working at all, to only a few professions, and that was the reality for Carrie Downer as she was growing up. And I'm sure she looked around and said, I can't preach, I can't be a lawyer, right? And so I can't run a business probably, so there are very few options that are open to me. And she was a very strong-willed woman with some certain gifts and talents. That may be part of what I think pushed her into spiritualism in a way. It was a way to make her name for herself under her own terms. Pure speculation on my part, but I'm sticking to it. Here's another thing that I thought was kind of unusual. And that typically for prominent families like the Downers, as you peruse the newspaper archives, you see mentions of not just them, but their children and offspring, right? They're prominent, people want to read about them, they're important, they're landed. There's no mention of Carrie Downer. Okay, she's the daughter of probably the most prominent merchant in town. No mention, zero. Nothing about school, nothing about her health, nothing about travel or anything like that. Zero.
She's on that list.
She's on that list. But this is in 1880. At this point, she's 27 years old, and she's got her first mention in the Baldwinsville Gazette and Farmers Journal. So I thought that spoke something too. And it's interesting what the article's about is that the editor made kind of a big deal out of, they had an election for school board trustees yesterday, and quite a number of ladies were in attendance. You know, this was before women's suffrage, but they showed up to vote. So solidarity, right? 33 cast ballots, and they elected new board members, none of whom were women. But you can see some prominent names along there. Carrie, And she got to be really good friends with a lady named Mrs. Denio. Does that name sound familiar to anyone? There's a street called Denio Street, right. Well, Mrs. Denio was a wealthy young widow because she had married very well. She married an older man, and his claim to fame was he owned the Otsego Fork Factory, which was at the time the largest factory on the Seneca River. He died very young. She inherited the factory. She was basically independently wealthy and became Carrie Downer's best friend, companion, and they traveled around a lot together, eventually moved to California together. So she's on there as well. But in 27 years, this is her first mention in the local press, you know, maybe she's feeling pretty good about it, right? I've finally made a name for myself. I'm in the press, October 18th, 1880. I'm 27 years old. 2 weeks later, not so good. So in 2 weeks, her brother outs her as a so-called spiritualist medium. So you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. So W.W. Downer was the oldest son, was in business with the father, was the village board president, was the president of the Lysander Republican Committee, was a candidate for a county role in politics, and a very strong-willed, very opinionated man. And I think he saw this as a potential risk to both the family business and to his political aspirations. I'm going to read this to you, and I cringe when I read it. But to the public, while believing that ordinarily a man should be indifferent to, or rather independent of public opinion, I recognize the fact that under circumstances it cannot be ignored and self-respect maintained, especially in such the case when his views on certain subjects or relation to certain people are liable to be misunderstood. So he goes on to be very clear, so he's not misunderstood. I therefore wish to publicly, as has already been done privately, okay, which means I've already told her this, disclaim all connection and sympathy with one Carrie E. Downer, a so-called spiritual medium. As to the merits of the business, religion, amusement, game, or whatever it's called in what she's engaged, I have nothing to say. Regarding the order in the same light, we would a lot of little dirty, ragged children playing in the street and smearing their own faces with mud while smiling at the absurdity and nastiness of their occupation and wondering why it is they know no better. Come to the conclusion they must have been born without brains. I should be pleased to have the woman above named, you can't even call her by name, say she'd already disowned me or had never considered herself as in any way related. Should like to have done without going into a trance, if possible. Snarky, way snarky. Such an avowal from her could not but advance me in the estimation of that entire portion of community whose esteem I or any sensible man cares for. And that to me is the definitive portion of the letter. He was all concerned with his reputation, not his sister's feelings. And I just thought it was kind of hurtful and mean. And I'm just glad she went on to become a very successful and prominent spiritualist and kind of went, there you go. You know, karma is a bitch because, you know, I think I can say that on PAC, I'm not sure. But, you know, she went on to, we're going to see fame and not fortune, but fame certainly pursuing her passion and her dream and her ambition in something that I believe she very much believed in. He got involved in a railroad scheme. People were indicted, went to prison, and he took off to Buffalo and had to start all over again. So much for his holier-than-thou diatribe in the newspaper. But not sure how Thanksgiving turned out that fall. So these are the things you dig and dig and dig, and I think probably maybe better left unsaid. So that's really all we know about Carrie, again, because there wasn't a lot publicized about this young lady until her brother outed her, right, and said, you're a spiritualist, which at the time was kind of a battle cry for some people that you're not Christian or worse. And so the second section is really to talk about what can we learn about spiritualism in Baldwinsville beyond. Was she the only one? What was she doing? Were other people interested? What was going on? This was a little harder to find out, but we'll do our best. Oh, okay, you saw that. So I thought this was pretty cool, but within 10 years of her birth, according to one source, 3 of the most influential 50 books in the world ever written were written. So, Gary, I know you kind of were looking at the answers, but anybody want to guess what they were? You're talking 1848 to 1859. You saw the last one? What was it?
Origin of species.
The Origin of the Species, right? Charles Darwin. That was all about religion versus evolution, right? What else? Okay. Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Everybody thinks it's a novel. No. According to Abraham Lincoln, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little woman who started this big war." Uncle Tom's Cabin was at the time, after the Bible, the most read publication in America, and it was a novel. So it really, I think, spurred abolition to the point where slavery became unacceptable to the North, not just something that was disavowed. The other was Karl Marx, right? And I'm going to tell you why I think that's important, but there they are. So Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. If I were going to have a beard, that'd be the beard I'd have right there. Can't grow one. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, very, very powerful, fictional, although based on true events, account of what life under a plantation master was really like, right? And then, of course, Darwin lit a bonfire when he wrote The Origin of the Species. So I think the reason I put this up is you had this period of 1845 to 55 to 60 where a lot of long-held beliefs in the world, not just in America, were being called into question, right? And so all these things that people believed for so long, we're starting to think maybe that's not so right. Maybe capitalism, pure capitalism in its purest form, doesn't work. Slavery is not just something to keep out of the North, it's something to abolish, and maybe there's more to this whole evolution thing. I think that had an influence. She only had an education up to the 8th grade, but you got to believe that in certain circles, and her father was in a lyceum, which was a discussion group, these topics came up, and I'm sure he brought them home and discussed them as well. So, you know, in the 1840s, a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville wrote another top 50 book called Democracy in America, and he was really aristocracy from France and decided to visit America to kind of see what all the fuss was about, right? So you had all these wars and conflicts going on in Europe, and America was just motoring along, extremely prosperous, and we seem to be doing just fine without a landed class or royalty. So he came to see for himself what all the fuss was about. And among other things, he said something about spiritualism and religion. He basically found religious madness quite common in America at this time. Although the desire to acquire the goods of this world is the dominant passion of Americans, we are selfish and materialistic, there are brief intervals where their souls seem to suddenly cast off all material bonds and fly impetuously toward heaven. In the states of the Union, but primarily in the partly settled regions of the West. Now, in that time, where was the West? The West was Western. It was Ohio, right? He's not talking about Colorado or California. They weren't even territories at that point. He's talking about Western New York and Ohio. That was the West. Entire families, elders, women, children across difficult country make their way through vast stretches of uninhabited forest to hear them. They neglect their private business, even their most pressing bodily needs, while listening to the preaching for days and nights on end, which was true. These revivals would go on for days while people were converted. Scattered throughout American society, one finds souls filled with an impassioned, almost wild spiritualism that one seldom encounters in Europe. From time to time, there arise bizarre sects or groups that attempt to open up extraordinary pathways to eternal happiness. Various forms of religious madness are quite common in the United States. So, you know, there's a reason we broke off from Europe. This religiosity paved the way for something called the Psychic Highway or the Burned Over District. Anybody hear of that before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this period was really game-changing for upstate New York.
Yeah, blame it on the canal.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no coincidence that there's the Erie Canal, right? Everybody attributes it to opening up commerce from the west to the east, but it also opened up ideas, new ideas, right? And so you had all these movements flourishing. You had the Shakers, the Oneida community, the Mormons, the Universal Friends, the Millerites, who believed in millennialism and that the world was going to end at any moment, and others throughout upstate New York.
Mormons, yeah.
And you had some pretty obscure little sects too, Like there was a commune in Skaneateles Falls in 1850, I don't know if anybody knows about it, where they basically said, no religion, no marriage, free love, communism. 1850 in Skaneateles. My, how that community has changed. So, another book says during the first century of independence, at least 30 spiritual movements, cults, utopian communities, or new religions started in upstate New York. So basically, you know, anything that challenged the status quo in religion, in politics, in society, had its start in upstate New York. Yes, partly because of the Erie Canal, but partly because of this burned over revivalism that also took place. People opened themselves up to a lot of new ideas. If, for any reason, you're as crazy as I am and you want to read more about the burned over district or what really happened, there's a couple of books up here I'd recommend if you have a lot of free time in your hands. The most fascinating is called Upstate Cauldron. I couldn't put it down. He basically researches every one of these little communities, sects. You know, everybody hears about the United Community, big deal. But there's a lot of little places that had some pretty crazy ideas, like the one I mentioned, and he goes into detail and visits each and every one of them and talks about the positives, the negatives, what they were able to achieve and accomplish. Most of them are long gone, but they did have an impact while they were here. Any questions about that? No. Okay. So in 1848 alone, I thought this was fascinating. 1 year, you had 3 big deals within 50 miles of where Carrie Downer lived. One was the Oneida Community, which I think is pretty well known what they were all about. Probably more socialist than communist, but it led to Oneida Silver and a going concern. But I think the real first organized practice at a socialist or communist society that really had legs and lasted a very, very long time. Another was women's suffrage. So a lot of people think this just came about on its own, but a lot of it had to do with the previous slides we just talked about, was this influx of new ideas and challenging the status quo. It actually took hold more with women than with men. And for many women it was, we don't get to vote. We don't get to do a lot of things that we probably should do and are capable of doing. It led directly to the women's suffrage movement and the convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls back then. This is actually the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which is a historical landmark now. Now the one you probably don't know up here, this tiny little obscure, unpreposing cabin is in Hydesville, New York, near Newark. And does anybody know what happened in Hydesville, New York, back in 1848?
The Remonstrance?
No.
Flushing Remonstrance? Oh, no, that's Flushing.
Okay, so what happened was 2 prepubescent teens started hearing rappings and tappings at night.
Yeah.
And they convinced their parents that these were spirits communicating from the great beyond. This was literally the start of spiritualism in America, was these 2 little girls in Hydesville, New York, and people came from far and wide to try to witness this. And the jury's kind of out as to whether they were legit or not. They came out and recanted as adults, but then they withdrew and said they really did do what they did. But basically what they were able to do is, with no really physical means of support, they would rap out and tap out messages from an itinerant man who traveled around and supposedly was murdered and buried in the basement of the house. And so they were able to convince hundreds and eventually thousands of people that they could do this, not just inside this little house, but eventually they were performing on stage in Rochester, New York City, Boston, in front of thousands of people, and were able to pull off, again, we don't know how much was true, how much was false. They claimed on their deathbeds that this was really coming from the great beyond. There are some that suggest they were double jointed and they were cracking their toes under the table, but you know, I'm not gonna judge.
Was that about the same time as the Salem people in Salem, Massachusetts?
No, this was 1850. Salem was really 1600s. Yeah. So they really weren't viewed as witches in so much as they were viewed as oddities, I think, more than anything else. Like half the people really wanted to try to figure out, is this true or not?
At what time, do you know the year when they were supposedly exposed as a fraud?
Well, there were a lot of people that tried to expose them over time. I want to say it was the 1890s.
Because I'm wondering how it compares to the disowning of the sister by the brother.
You know, there's a lot to be said for that, because in the 1880s they came under scrutiny. In the 1890s they actually recanted and then withdrew that confession. So I think you may have something there. Is, you know, this attracted a lot of people that maybe didn't believe in what they were doing and were taking advantage of the system, gaming the system, and so that could have had a lot to do with his criticism of his sister. I already talked about this. They heard rappings and tappings. What's interesting is after they recanted, the house was sold to another party. The basement was excavated, and they found the skeleton of a person who'd been murdered. So, you know, was it a plant? I don't know. You know, who knows? But that kind of makes you a little suspicious. Did they really have something going or not? Here it shows how they were producing the wrappings. You can see her under the table manipulating her toes. If you want to amuse your friends or scare your family, you might try that. This blew me away. We're talking just 10 years later. This took off so much. This one event really is what drove spiritualism in upstate New York. Within 10 years, there were 100 registered spiritual mediums or trance speakers in upstate New York. I didn't know you had to register for such a thing. I mean, but somebody had a registry, and you can see this is Baldwinsville. The real hotbed, as I've come to find out, a little too late for this presentation, was Auburn, New York. That was where this really took off. And the landed class in Auburn really pursued this in a big way. They were wealthy enough to bring in spiritualists and mediums. They held seances constantly. I don't know if that's still the case, Gary. You could probably let me know. But I thought that was pretty bizarre that it spread like wildfire. You know, and then interest in spiritualism peaked after the Civil War. I mean, tragically, you had 750,000 men lost their lives, mostly of marrying age, 18 to 45. You were left with a lot of war widows, right? They were grieving. It was a horrible time, and they were looking for ways to reconnect with the loved ones they had lost. And so spiritualism became a way not just to communicate with the dead, but actually try to maintain a relationship with your loved one after they'd already passed away. Interestingly enough, on the right, Mary Todd Lincoln. You've heard of the madness of Mrs. Lincoln. It's rumored that seances were actually held in the White House during the presidency and that Abraham Lincoln attended. I think he quipped that after 2 seances that he wasn't getting any better advice than he was from his cabinet, so he gave them up. Another offshoot of spiritualism, unfortunately, was spirit photography, which was debunked several times. But Mary Todd Lincoln was in a rough shape. Let's face it, she had lost 2 sons and her husband at that point in very tragic ways, and she was coming unglued. And her oldest son actually had her institutionalized, partly because of spiritualism, partly because she was giving all the money away, and that was an issue as well. In this picture, I don't know if you can see it, but over her left-hand shoulder, that's supposedly Abraham Lincoln, right? So somebody took this picture and said, there he is. He's right there with you. So she kind of believed in that. What's interesting and what I uncovered, kind of an unknown little tidbit, was in 1872, she traveled to Auburn to conduct seances with this group of people I talked about. While she was there, she heard about a woman named Mary Andrews who lived in Moravia, New York. Mary Andrews was an illiterate Irish immigrant who came over as a servant and worked for another family, determined she had a talent for conducting seances. Within just short order, she owned the largest tourist destination on southern Owasco Lake. So, you know, you get enough people to come in and shell out money, pretty soon you own a hotel. And so Mary Todd Lincoln came down and had a seance with Mary Andrews. They tried to keep it very hush-hush because the family didn't want anybody knowing that, but it is in a newspaper article that she was there. She did have a seance with Mary Andrews, and nobody really knows what happened. That hotel Beautiful place, but it's since burned. It was right on the west side of the inlet, right near a place called Long Hill Road. Anyway, that's a little secret message to people in the room. The last thing, I think in 1879, spiritualists got together and said, you know, we ought to have our own places to go, where we can congregate as a group and bring people from all over. One place formed, probably the most famous, and it's still there and still operating, is called Lilydale. Has anyone heard of it? Yeah? Been there? Pretty remarkable place. So it was like a camp atmosphere where it was open for the summer. They had cottages. They had the giant Maple Grove Hotel in the bottom left-hand corner. And they had seances, they had trance speakers. Think of it as a Renaissance fair for spiritualists. You could travel this thing and get different services and talk to like-minded people. In the top, they actually revered the birthplace of spiritualism. That's the actual cabin where the Fox sisters heard the rappings and the tappings. The Lilydale people were so enthusiastic about it, they took it up and moved it 150 miles from Hydesville, New York, near Newark, all the way down to Cassadaga Lake and reassembled it. And it subsequently burned. But I thought it was interesting. They had a lot of really prominent people that visited Lilydale. People like Horace Greeley, probably one of the most powerful people in New York State, helped to get Seward elected governor, helped to get Lincoln elected president, would go there. And the one thing they had in common was all of them had lost loved ones, and they were trying to reach out and communicate with them. So really desperate people. I thought this quote was great. Right there you see Susan B. Anthony, one of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement, probably the leader, seated at far right. She was a frequent visitor to Lilydale, where she was invited to speak at annual Women's Day celebrations. I like this. I think I would have liked this lady. Although not a spiritualist herself, she did visit a medium and get a message said to be from her aunt. Anthony's response was, I didn't like her when she was alive, and I don't want to hear from her now. Why don't you bring someone interesting like Elizabeth Cady Stanton? So much for that.
So that was sort of like Chautauqua, maybe?
Yes, exactly. It was another form of Chautauqua, but all devoted to spiritualism. There's still a museum there. I was in touch with the curator. Yeah.
Where is it? Where is Cassadaga Lake?
It's in western New York in Chautauqua County, I think, north of Dunkirk. Yeah, like Jamestown area, that kind of way. If you want to go visit in the summer. Okay, so that's kind of what was going on with spiritualism in central New York, upstate New York, Baldwinsville. It clearly was a big deal. So what do we know about Carrie Downer? And this is the part where I think it really starts to get fascinating. In the 1880s, this is just after what I just told you about the 1870s and what happened with Mary Todd Lincoln and Lilydale and everything else, Carrie Downer really kind of took off. I think she said to her brother, I'll show you. And she basically traveled some 36 times in 28 places just in the 1880s. She was in high demand. She was a trance speaker and a lecturer. And under trance, as I mentioned earlier, she could give poems in the style of Poe and Longfellow and long since deceased literary figures that were very, very accurate. They weren't word for word, but they were in the style of the day. So whether you liked or didn't like her, you had a woman with an 8th grade education and no power and no experience channeling the spirits of literary figures and doing a pretty good job of it. So either she really believed in what she was doing and she had something going on, or she got smart fast. She concentrated a lot of her efforts in this area of southwestern Onondaga County, southeastern Madison County, where spiritualism really took off in a lot of these small churches and small communities. She spoke, interestingly enough, there weren't a lot of places to speak publicly like halls like this one. You had to talk at churches. And so you had to find churches that were open to it. Primarily Baptist churches and especially Universalist churches were open to it because of their dogma. They had very little dogma. There she is. I haven't yet shown a picture of her. She looks like a woman who didn't suffer fools gladly and spoke her mind. So in 1882 alone, she spoke at 8 different upstate locations, none of them close together, really. And so you think about it. Again, I got a lot of time on my hands. A couple weeks ago, traced her steps, and I tried to go to each one of these places in a car with highways, right? and GPS and everything else that goes along with it, and tried to snap photos of where she went. And it took me a whole day. So can you imagine traveling from Beeville to Brookfield? Does anybody even know where Brookfield is? It's in not trying to besmirch Brookfield, but it's in southeastern Madison County. There's really no easy way to get there, right? There's no way to get there from here. So these places were pretty remote, and you can imagine she probably had to travel by train to a junction, wherever that was, probably in a big city like Utica, and then had to take a coach, or in the winter, a sleigh, right? Because there were no roads, certainly not paved roads, and there was no automotive transportation. I was reading one of my great-great-great-grandfather's diary about this time. We were blessed. We got about 4 diaries from 1878 to 1882. He was a farmer. He lived out in Lysander. There wasn't a lot of commentary about world events, but he would go in and every day he'd talk about the weather. And the one that impressed me the most was in March. And he said something like, terrible, dismal day, muddy and snowy. And he said, some go by wagon, some go by sleigh, most don't go at all. So it was, you know, a lot of people stayed home when the weather got bad, but she was moving around a lot and found like-minded spirits in different communities to stay with. So hats off to her. Yeah. Just want to show you a couple places. They're not only beautiful in and of themselves, but most of them are still standing, and some are National Historic Landmarks at this point, like the Baptist Church in Delphi Falls. You can see on the left how it looked probably 100 or so years ago. And the resident said, you know, she gave us 2 discourses, poems from subjects given by the audience, which were very fine. She's a very good inspirational speaker. She seemed to have a great reception pretty much wherever she went. The people in Pompey helped me out. She spoke at a schoolhouse, the Clue Schoolhouse. Young lady, trance speaker, been lecturing, reading test poems to large and delighted audiences. They're readily rehearsed with the grace and power of an elocutionist, and she seems destined to make her mark on the world, which she very much did. That little schoolhouse is since burned, but you can see sometimes they were grand locations like halls and churches, and sometimes they were just a little one-room schoolhouse, wherever she could find believers to talk to. Cazenovia, this is the old Universalist church. There's a little map that shows where it is on the corner there of William Street, and down here, right there, you can see it. That's what's left. It's now an apartment house, but it's still standing. So if anybody desires to go track down all the places where Carrie Downer spoke, I've got some leads. Spoke in North Hannibal at the Baptist Church. They really liked her. They listened with marked attention and almost breathless silence, kind of like tonight. And at the end of her lecture, she calls for subjects from the audience, improvises poems, some of which are beautiful. Whether she speaks from spirit inspiration or not, her lectures are charming and elevating. So in some cases, people just enjoyed having somebody there who was eloquent and could speak, because you didn't see that a lot. Another book I read said this was really important for women at the time because there weren't a lot of opportunities for them to speak in public. They could not be pastors. They could not be preachers. They could not run for office. They were not parts of these social and fraternal organizations like the Masons that had opportunities, or Odd Fellows, to speak. This was it. So if you wanted to be someone who could speak in front of large groups of people, and for the men at the time, they were entirely unused to seeing women from the podium. And it had an almost mesmerizing effect on a lot of them. They were fascinated because they were not used to women being in a position of authority, speaking down to them in a position of authority about things they knew a lot about. And so a lot of these guys were kind of smitten and swooned when these women came around. She went out to North Collins to the Friends of Human Progress, which is a former Quaker group. That little house is still there and looks almost identical as it did. North Collins is way out there. You're talking Erie County, so she had to hike to go there as well. That was in April. This one is subject for another discussion. For those of you who have time and want to stay afterwards, I will tell you, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'm the kind of guy that will drive up, hi, how you doing? Here's what I'm doing. If you don't want me here, I'm cool with that. But most people are really interested in the history of their home or their business, the building, whatever. They want to help, or at least want to hear. I literally got chased away by the woman here. Called the New York State Troopers for the first time in my life because I thought this woman was going to kill me because I was taking pictures of her of the place she owned, because that was, in her mind, intellectual property, which you may want to look into that one. That's kind of interesting that you own the image of a place, not just the place itself. Great story. For a future time. This place was phenomenal, and it's held up in this book as probably one of this author's favorite places in upstate New York to go visit, because it was designed specifically to hold seances and spiritualist lectures. It's called the Spirit House, or Brown's Hall, in Georgetown, New York, Madison County. The style's called a wedding cake style. You can see all the hangings from the eaves. Those are all original. And he built the upstairs to specific architectural specifications to be conducive to spirits. So the downstairs was the Spirit House, the upstairs was called Brown's Hall after the guy who built it. And it was a mecca for spiritualists. Very interesting place. Another place not easy to get to in rural Madison County. Unfortunately, the person who owns it now has let it fall into tremendous disrepair, and it may not make it. It probably will have to be condemned and torn down, which is a shame. It's probably one of the most unique properties I've seen in New York State. The Baptist Church in Erieville, another very remote location. I love this little expression down in the corner. Can you read that for me, Eliza? I don't know if you can. Right here. Right there. Oh, here it is. Thou shalt not kill, go vegan. So I did not expect to find that at the Baptist Church in Erieville. But again, you find stuff everywhere you go. It's kind of cool. They liked her. They thought she was an inspirational speaker and a very able advocate of the cause. I'm not going to go through every one of these, just the ones in 82. Brookfield, she spoke at the Baptist Church. You can see, again, circa 1880. That's a shot I took just a couple of weeks ago. It used to be called Clarkville. She discoursed to the people on spiritualism. She's spirited and interesting, holds an audience, not too deeply prejudiced, at command. Again, so if you're not too prejudiced, then she's a good.
Where are all these quotes coming from?
They are coming from newspaper articles where they spoke about her visit and how impressed they were.
She eventually did make the papers.
Oh yeah, yep, in a good way. So much for her brother. But these are after he said and did what he did.
Was he still around at the time, or was he?
He was pursuing business interests and getting indicted. So the Doolittle House is another place. Big deal. Biggest hotel in Oswego at the time, overlooking the Oswego River. It burned down, but this is its replacement. It was the Pontiac Hotel. It's now an apartment building, gorgeous building. You can look at it from either side of the river, from First Street on the west side of the river or over on the east. It's really a commanding property overlooking the Oswego. Anybody who was anybody, and Oswego was a hopping town back then, came to the Doolittle House. And there was an interesting little incident there. Professor Slade, who, unlike Carrie Downer, I think, was in it for money, and was not always above board. He set Oswego all agog with his mysterious productions. Miss Downer, a trance medium from Beeville, will assist him in exhibiting things spiritual to the people at the Doolittle House this evening. Admission 25 cents. So not a lot of money, but yeah. So, from one paper, they kind of had a good take on it. 20 people attended a reception. It went really well. They said she's about 21. She was 28. She seems honest, not highly educated. She's what's known as a trance medium. It goes on and talks about, under the influence, she delivered a most interesting lecture of which evolution was the subject. She delineated the theory of evolution, tracing life from infinitesimal atoms to the highest forms of human existence and the still further developed spirit life. She employed many scientific terms, and the production was superior to any impromptu effort by a person well versed in the theory. Someone in the audience desired to hear from Longfellow, and he kindly responded through the medium of Miss Downer. He thanked them for calling him, and then he proceeded to compare his earthly existence to his spiritual. This is Longfellow now. This was also couched in the choicest language and was a most charming address. She next passed under the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, and delivered 2 poems which are identical with Poe's style, but were of entirely new composition and considerable length. These feats were performed in a well-lighted room. She declares that she knows nothing of what she says, either before or after the trance. These expositions are certainly remarkable, and we do not know that they have any strictly scientific explanation. So, again, you had a woman with an 8th grade education talking about Darwin and evolution, quoting Longfellow and Poe and the style. So it makes you wonder what was really going on here. Things went bad from there, unfortunately, that night. This guy was a real ne'er-do-well. He eventually got chased out of the United States. This guy was a buffoon. Another guy who got indicted for bribery and collusion and eventually went to prison. But at the time he was in Oswego, he was a high roller. He was very, very important. He was politically connected and very, very wealthy. The liveliest experience this guy had in Oswego was the night he and Carrie Downer gave a seance in the parlor of the Doolittle house. It goes on, but this guy basically said he arose and announced he'd neither seen nor heard anything but what could be done by deception and collusion. Probably incendiary words. He called upon the mediums to give tests, which means he wanted them to prove what they were doing and how they were doing it. And a lively passage at once ensued. Women were drawn into the discussion, which became so exciting that the doctor, Archibald, suddenly announced the meeting closed. He's trying to avoid a problem. Several gentlemen gathered in one of the parlors where liquor and cigars were discussed, and probably drank and smoked, too. Mattoon didn't like what he saw. He called, Dr. Archibald became excited, called Mattoon a liar and a coward. Now, this is still 1880-something, too. Those were fighting words in those days with certain people.
He walked over the wine table.
Yep. Filled a glass of liquor and dashed it in the doctor's face. The doctor sputtered, and picking up the decanter, Mattoon emptied its contents on his head. The doctor retreated, and Slade showed a disposition to take part, in other words, get involved. Mattoon advanced toward him, and Dr. Slade backed out of the door. And this is my favorite part. Putting his thumb to his nose and gyrating his fingers in a manner well known to schoolboys as he disappeared. So, where was video, right? I would have loved to have seen that on YouTube. That didn't go over well. It created quite a sensation. I love this last. This ended Dr. Slade's career here. He afterward went to Canada, where he was charged with some serious offenses. So I think Mattoon, although he probably didn't approach it correctly, was right all along that Slade was probably not on the up and up. Where is Carrie Downer? Who knows? I think the jury's still out. Unfortunately, poor Carrie had to write a note to both papers in Oswego. Sir, I wish to make a statement of facts to correct the statement made by a party who attended the meeting held on Wednesday evening. I was a guest of his wife, invited by her and the doctor to deliver a lecture in the parlor. Dr. Slade was invited to be present. I was accused of being in league with Slade to swindle the people out of their money. I wish to say that he did not receive any pay, neither did he expect any. And as for myself, I've not received anything, nor do I expect to. The money that was taken in went to pay Mr. Ives for the room and the light. So I think she got caught up in a situation she couldn't control with a guy she probably should have avoided. Still single at this point, and probably pushing 30 though. So at that time, what were her options? Sadly, that wasn't the only thing that happened, I think, to derail her, and I believe her brother was responsible for this. In 1885, and I had to really dig for this, but this showed up in the Baldwinsville Gazette and Farmers Journal in 1885. We recognize a familiar face in a Denver paper illustrating a grand materializing seance, an expose of spiritualism by Dr. Hiltz. The likeness is very good. Now that sounds unusual. How in the 1880s would you find a paper from Denver? Well, it's my understanding that a lot of the local papers like the Gazette would keep other papers in-house that they could borrow stories from. Whether there was no AP or UPI or internet, but they would order papers from the New York Tribune, you name it, papers all over the country. This probably showed up, and they saw a wonderful opportunity to make fun of Carrie. I'm completely convinced that this was an attempt to make her look stupid, because this woman conducting a seance where lots of bizarre things are happening, I think is supposed to be Carrie Downer. There was no one else in Beeville, female or otherwise, who was conducting spiritualism at the time. So it just goes to show you kind of what she had to face in her time.
There's a black cat.
Yeah, the black cat's great. To pursue her passion. We're winding down for those of you who are getting tired or hungry. She kind of closed out her career here. Her last presentation was in 1888. As I said, she went had about 36 engagements in the 1880s in about 28 places. And at the Oddfellows Hall in Syracuse was really her coup de grace. I've got a long article here. I'm not going to read it all, but it was glowing. 100 well-dressed and thoughtful-looking people were in Oddfellows Hall to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the birth of spiritualism with the Fox sisters in Hydesville. She took the stage more than once in the afternoon, once in the evening, and the article from Syracuse was glowing in terms of how well she performed and how she carried herself and how genuine everything seemed to her. So I feel kind of good that she went out with a bang in 1888. I think at that point she decided that enough was enough. She wasn't going to hang here anymore. And by year end, 1888, she'd moved to California, kind of reinvented herself. A lot of people do that in California. A lot more things are possible. These are all periodicals of the time that were national in scope, that were devoted to spiritualism or similar pursuits. She's mentioned in all of them, not just in passing, but as a leader of the movement in California. She presented at multiple venues in California. She was loved and esteemed by everybody out there. She eventually married, settled down, had a daughter, relocated there not only with her mother, who was a widow at the time, but also Mrs. Denio, who would become her companion and friend. So all three of them moved to California and left Baldwinsville forever. And that kind of takes me to my last slide. It's, there she is. That's the last known photo that we have of her. She passed away in 1918, an Advent believer in spiritualism till the end. That's the Downer House on 19 Downer Street. I tried to get in touch with the owners one more time, but when I wrote this article some 10 years ago, I did get in touch with the folks that lived there. And it was interesting what they told me. The owner said, well, I asked him, is there anything unusual about the house, right? Because Carrie lived there a long time and was a practicing spiritualist. He said, well, not with our family, but prior residents, and there were two prominent Beeville families that lived there before, claimed that at night when the children were getting into bed, there was a woman in a green dress that was wandering around the hallways, tucking them in and making sure they were all right. Hard to explain, but I think a lot of people like to think that that was Carrie Downer's spirit, returning to Baldwinsville, trying to make sure that everything was okay, and trying to leave with her reputation intact. Anyway, very, very interesting young lady, had a huge impact, I think, on Baldwinsville, but one you won't read about in any of the books I showed you here earlier. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, questions?
Thank you.
The slide before the one that showed the 1882, the slide that just previously was previous to that one, where she talked to so many places. How many were there? 30 something?
In the 1880s, you can only go by what's reported in the paper. There may have been many, many more, but what I got was,
Back to that.
yeah, it's 36 locations 36 appearances in 28 locations, I think, in the 1880s. She got around. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, that's the 1880s. I didn't get that one.
And again, just if you want to, got nothing to do. It's beautiful country. Get in the car and drive to southwestern Madison County. These places are hard to find and hard to get to.
Wedding cake house.
Pardon me?
I said, don't go to the wedding cake house.
Well, yeah. I got caught taking a picture from across the road on the highway and made the mistake of engaging the lady in conversation. Anyway, other questions?
Yeah, where did you come across the numbers and places that you spoke? Is it a book somewhere?
Tedious.
He's a
Newspaper
researcher.
searches. So there's a website called FultonHistory.com, and it has just about every newspaper from upstate New York and beyond back to it actually has the original Onondaga County newspaper, which was published in Baldwinsville in the 1840s. and you put in search terms and you can find things. So I put in search terms for her, and she turned up in different places. So again, it's only when I'm able to verify. My guess is she probably went a lot of places and it was never documented. It could easily be twice that number.
This is times like this one, I wish I had a smartphone, but is this?
I got one. You want to borrow?
No, I'm gonna ask you, is this generally the time era of the Cardiff Giant?
Bonnie, good question. Cardiff Giant, I think,
Not
was...
Lysander history, so.
So, Cardiff Giant was a stone giant found, I believe, in the 1880s, 90s.
Cooperstown right now, laying there.
About 1870.
Okay. And so it was dug up and was purported to be the petrified remains of a giant. It's actually near Lafayette.
Oh yeah, I've been down there.
Yeah.
Just trying to, was there a fertile ground for that kind
Yes.
of thinking back in those days?
Yep.
Because people were realizing there was more to, people were learning things.
They were questioning. I think they were questioning things they'd always been told.
Opening up
Yep.
more questions that you could answer in their lifetime.
The thing I love about the Cardiff Giant is, people came and paid what were then a lot of money to see the Cardiff Giant. And P.T. Barnum was very active in New York at the time, and of course wanted it for his menagerie. And so he came to Lafayette or wherever it is and tried to buy it, and the guy wouldn't sell it. So what does P.T. Barnum do? He takes his own and makes it out of concrete and plaster and says, I got my own. So, it didn't really matter whether it was real or not. It was the fact of the idea of the Cardiff Giant.
October 16th, 1869.
Wow, you were very close. Bonnie does have a smartphone.
Yeah. It's not in my brain.
Other questions? Yeah.
I wonder how she lived. Did she get paid, or did she use family money, or what?
Very good question. And again, I think she was in that position where she came from a prominent family. I was able to find out she was left a legacy from her father's former business partner, who died when she and her sister were 5 and 7. And he left her $500 in 1860, which was a lot of money. And so her family also, she lived with her family, and so she had no visible means of support. And so again, if she hadn't been from the kind of family she was and hadn't had the kind of money she had, she would have been a milliner or run a boarding house or some of the other things that we saw up there. Or she would have had to marry well, and that wasn't always an opportunity, especially after the Civil War when there were a lot less eligible men running around. Yeah. I mean, 750,000, I believe it was 8% of the eligible men in the North between the ages of 18 and 45 died during the Civil War. So you went in 5 years you lost 8% of your eligible men. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity there. Others? Great. Okay, good. Thank you.